They delivered the notification at 07 station time in a sealed diplomatic envelope, which was the Council's formal protocol for communications of significant gravity, and which meant that the junior aide who handed it to me had no knowledge of what it contained and was simply performing a function she had been assigned. I thanked her by name. I had made a point, over 11 years as Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council, of learning the names of every aide, every clerk, every administrative staff member who worked in the corridors and offices I moved through daily. Not as a strategy, because they were people doing their jobs, and people doing their jobs deserve to be acknowledged. The envelope contained 3 documents. The first was a formal notification from the Council's Interspecies Relations Directorate, informing me that Ambassador Chen Wei had died in custody at Processing Facility 7 on Theta Prime Station at 23:40 the previous evening, as a result of what the document described as a processing error in the administration of standard detainment protocols. The second was a formal expression of regret from the Directorate's presiding administrator, 4 sentences long, precisely calibrated to convey condolence without admitting liability. The third was a settlement offer, 200,000 Council credits, payable to Earth's Diplomatic Mission Fund, and an invitation to nominate a human representative to a newly created Cultural Liaison Subcommittee whose function, as described in the attached charter, was primarily ceremonial. My name is Director Yemi Adeyemi. I am 66 years old. I spent 17 years as a field analyst for Earth's Strategic Intelligence Division, 8 years as the Deputy Director of Earth's Interspecies Affairs Bureau, and the last 11 years as Earth's senior representative to the Galactic Council's full diplomatic assembly. I have spent those 11 years in rooms where decisions were made about human lives by species who had concluded, based on 60 years of careful observation, that humanity's response to any provocation would always remain within a predictable range. Formal protests, diplomatic notes, demands for review, the specific repertoire of grievances available to a junior member with no meaningful leverage. Chen Wei had been my colleague for 7 of those 11 years. He was 54 years old. He had a daughter in Beijing and a son studying environmental engineering in São Paulo, and a habit of bringing me tea on Tuesday mornings without being asked, because he had noticed early in our working relationship that I consistently forgot to eat or drink anything before noon on committee days. He had been detained 3 days earlier on what the Council's processing documentation described as a routine security review, flagged by an automated system for a documentation irregularity in his transit credentials that his legal team had identified as a clerical error and submitted a correction filing for within 6 hours of the detention. He was the 3rd human ambassador to die in Council custody in 8 years. The first had been described as a medical emergency. The second had been described as an accidental fall during a facility transfer. Each time, the Council's internal review had cleared the relevant facility within 48 hours, issued a formal expression of regret, and offered a settlement that Earth's legal team had accepted under protest because the alternative, litigation through the Council's dispute resolution process, was a procedure that had never once, in 60 years of Council history, produced a judgment adverse to a founding member species. I read all 3 documents twice. I placed them back in the envelope. I sat in my office for 14 minutes without moving, looking at the photograph on my desk that Chen Wei had taken on his first visit to the colony world of New Carthage 3 years ago, standing in front of a field of wheat with the expression of someone experiencing genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Then I opened my secured communicator and transmitted a single coded signal on a frequency that had been established for this specific purpose 11 years ago. On the same day I had accepted my appointment as senior representative and been briefed, in a facility beneath the Atacama Desert, on the thing that humanity had been building in the dark since the second ambassador died. The signal was 12 characters. It meant, begin. I want to tell you about Dr. Su Yan Park, because the thing that humanity built cannot be understood without understanding her first, and because she would have preferred, I think, to be understood correctly rather than simply credited. Su Yan was born in Busan in 2037, the daughter of 2 forensic accountants, and she spent the first 20 years of her career doing something that her colleagues in Earth's intelligence services described as the most tedious form of important work they had ever encountered. She traced money. Not dramatically, not through high-stakes field operations or encrypted courier networks. She traced money through paperwork, through the specific, patient, unglamorous process of following financial documentation across jurisdictions, across currencies, across the hundreds of shell entities and nominee structures that sophisticated actors use to move resources they prefer not to have associated with their names, until she arrived at the point where the paper ended and the actual person began. She was very good at it. She was possibly the best forensic financial analyst of her generation, and the reason she was the best was not that she was smarter than her peers, though she was, but that she understood something about financial documentation that most analysts never fully internalized. That money, when it moves, leaves a record, and that records, when they are created by people who want them to be incomplete, are always incomplete in characteristic ways. The incompleteness itself was information. The gap between what a document said and what a document had to have been based on, given what surrounded it, was often more revealing than anything the document actually contained. She had applied this insight to the Galactic Council's financial infrastructure in 2074, 2 years after the first human ambassador died in custody, at the request of Earth's Strategic Intelligence Division, which had concluded that the 3 recurring questions they most needed answered about the Council: who actually controlled what, who was paying whom for what, and what the real relationship was between the founding 5 species' official positions and their actual interests, were all, ultimately, financial questions. It had taken her 4 years to develop a methodology. The Council's financial systems were, she later told me, simultaneously more sophisticated and more vulnerable than she had expected. More sophisticated because they had been built by species with centuries of experience obscuring financial relationships from each other and from junior members. More vulnerable because those same species had never, in those centuries, encountered a forensic analyst who was looking for the gaps rather than the content, and who had the specific patience to build, document by document, a picture of what had to be true based on what was demonstrably missing. By 2078, Su Yan's team had produced what the Strategic Intelligence Division internally called the Atlas, a continuously updated, comprehensively documented map of the actual financial relationships underlying the Council's political structure. Not the official relationships, the real ones. The licensing agreements that appeared to be between 2 independent species but traced, through 7 layers of intermediary entities, to a single controlling interest in a founding species' sovereign wealth fund. The infrastructure contracts that officially represented competitive procurement but whose payment flows revealed coordination that would have been illegal under the Council's own anti-monopoly provisions. The research grants that were nominally awarded through an independent scientific body, but whose ultimate funding traced to a Vethrani defense procurement account. The Atlas was not primarily evidence of corruption, though it contained a great deal of that. It was primarily evidence of structure, the real architecture of power and interest that the Council's official institutional design was built on top of, and that the official design was specifically constructed to obscure. Su Yan had been maintaining and expanding the Atlas for 16 years when I transmitted the activation signal. By that point, the documentation it contained ran to approximately 40,000 individual financial instruments, 847 tracing chains of varying complexity, and 23 separate clusters of activity that Earth's legal team had assessed as constituting clear violations of the Council's own financial regulations, independently verifiable, admissible under the Council's own evidentiary standards, and implicating in varying degrees of directness representatives of all 5 founding species. The Atlas was not a weapon, it was a mirror, a precise, legally verified, completely documented mirror that showed the Council's most powerful members exactly what they actually looked like, in a format they could not dispute without disputing the validity of their own financial reporting systems. I had told the Strategic Intelligence Division when I was first briefed on the Atlas that I hoped we would never need to use it. Director Okonkwo, who had been running the program at that point for 6 years, had looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has already processed the hope I was expressing and arrived, some time before, at a different conclusion. "We will need to use it," she said. "The only question is when." Chen Wei's photograph on my desk, the wheat field, his uncomplicated happiness, we were using it now. The second element of what Director Okonkwo had named Project Lantern, with the specific dry humor of someone who had spent years building things in the dark and appreciated the metaphor, was what the project's operational files called the network. I want to describe the network carefully, because it is the element of Project Lantern most vulnerable to mischaracterization, and because Su Yian cared very much about being described accurately. The network consisted of 41 individuals embedded within the Council's administrative, diplomatic, and technical infrastructure. Not spies in the conventional sense. People who had entered legitimate careers in Council service and had, over periods ranging from 7 to 22 years, built genuine expertise, genuine professional relationships, and genuine institutional knowledge. People who had reached positions where they had access to information, processes, and decisions that were relevant to Earth's interests, and that Earth had no other reliable way to understand. Each of them was human. Each of them had entered their position through a cover identity documented with sufficient depth and verifiable detail to withstand the kind of routine background checking that Council institutions applied to administrative and technical staff. None of them carried any operational equipment that could be traced to Earth. None of them communicated with Earth's intelligence services through any method that used Council-monitored infrastructure. And none of them had been placed in their positions to steal information, report conversations, or interfere with Council processes. This is the point I want to be precise about, because the distinction matters enormously, and because it was the founding principle of the network from the day Su Yian proposed it in a briefing room in the Atacama facility, 11 years ago. In a room where I was the most skeptical person present, the 41 network members had been placed in their positions to understand. To develop over years of genuine professional engagement, a complete and accurate picture of how the Council actually functioned at the operational level, not the political level, not the strategic level, but the level of day-to-day process, decision, and administration where the gap between official procedure and actual practice was most visible and most consequential. The information they provided was not classified intelligence. It was operational knowledge. The difference between knowing that a regulation existed and understanding how it was actually applied. The difference between knowing that a process had formal steps and understanding which steps were genuinely enforced and which were routinely waived. The difference between knowing that a filing was required and knowing which clerk in which division had the authority to expedite or delay it, and what, in practice, determined which outcome occurred. Chen Wei's detention had been flagged as routine. His correction filing had been submitted within 6 hours. Under the Council's published detention protocols, a documentation correction filing in process suspended detention pending review. The network's member in the Interspecies Processing Division had identified, 6 hours after Chen Wei's detention, that the correction filing had been received, logged, and then routed by a specific administrative decision that did not appear in any official record to a secondary review queue rather than to the standard suspension process. She had transmitted that information to me through a method I will not describe. I had transmitted it to Earth's legal team. Earth's legal team had filed an emergency habeas petition with the Council's judicial administration within 2 hours, citing the specific routing decision and the specific regulation it violated. The petition had been received, logged, and assigned to a review panel that had a standard 72-hour response window. Chen Wei had been dead before the 72 hours elapsed. I am telling you this sequence in detail because I want you to understand precisely what the activation signal was responding to. Not a single act of cruelty, though what happened to Chen Wei was cruel. A system, a carefully constructed, deliberately maintained system in which the forms of due process existed to create legal protection for the people administering that process, while the substance of due process could be routed to a secondary queue by an administrative decision that appeared in no official record. and that, under the Council's evidentiary standards, as they had been interpreted for 60 years, could not be proven to have occurred because the routing decision itself was not logged. This was not an accident. It was not a processing error. It was a system that had been built and maintained specifically because it was useful, and it had been useful 3 times in 8 years, and it would have continued to be useful indefinitely if the people using it had correctly understood what humanity had been doing in the 11 years since the second ambassador died. They had not correctly understood. The 40 minutes after I transmitted the activation signal were the quietest 40 minutes I can remember in 11 years of council work. I sat in my office. I did not make calls. I did not review documents. I looked at Chen Wei's photograph, and I thought about the fact that he would not have wanted what was coming next. He had been a diplomat in the specific way that means you believe, genuinely and without performance, that conversation is almost always the better option. He had spent 7 years finding the better option in rooms where most people had stopped looking for it. I had spent 11 years doing the same thing. The activation signal was not an acknowledgement that conversation had failed. It was an acknowledgement that we had been having the wrong conversation, for reasons that the people on the other side of it had been carefully maintaining. At 09:30 station time, Su Yian's legal team transmitted the first tranche of Atlas documentation to the Council's Financial Integrity Oversight Committee. The transmission was formatted exactly as the Oversight Committee's regulations required for formal evidentiary submissions, because Su Yian had reviewed those regulations personally and had designed the submission format to make procedural rejection as difficult as possible. It was accompanied by a formal complaint filing citing 17 specific regulatory violations, each one cross-referenced to the relevant regulation, the specific financial instrument that constituted the violation, and the tracing chain that connected that instrument to the entity responsible. The complaint was filed by Earth's diplomatic mission, which had the standing to file it under Council regulations. It was filed against 6 entities, 4 of which were financial vehicles associated with founding species' sovereign interests, and 2 of which were officials currently serving in the Council's administrative structure. At 09:45, the second tranche was transmitted. This one went to the Council's Judicial Oversight Board and cited the specific administrative decision that had routed Chen Wei's correction filing to the secondary review queue. The identity of the administrator who had made that decision, the communication between that administrator and a senior official in the Interspecies Relations Directorate that had preceded the routing decision by approximately 40 minutes, a communication that existed in the Council's own internal records and that the network's member in the Administrative Archive Division had identified and provided the specific access pathway for, and a formal demand for criminal investigation into the deaths of all 3 human ambassadors. At 10:15, the third tranche was transmitted to all 412 Council member species simultaneously. This was the most comprehensive Atlas documentation, not the 17 violations cited in the Oversight Committee complaint, but the full pattern. 83 documented instances of financial coordination between founding species interests that constituted regulatory violations. 41 instances of official action that traced, through documented financial relationships, to private interests that the acting official was required by Council law to have disclosed and recused themselves from, and, most significantly, a complete financial reconstruction of the 3 detention events in which human ambassadors had died, showing the payment flows that connected the Council's detention processing system to private interests that benefited, in each case, from the removal of the specific ambassador involved. The third tranche was not filed as a formal complaint. It was transmitted as a public evidentiary disclosure under a provision of the Council's transparency regulations that allowed member species to place documented evidence of regulatory violations into the public record when internal complaint processes had demonstrably failed to address those violations. The provision had existed for 40 years. It had never been used because it required a member species with sufficient documented evidence and sufficient nerve to use it. We had both. By 11:30, the Council's financial markets had registered the first significant movements. By 13, 6 junior member species had filed their own supplementary complaints, citing specific portions of the Atlas documentation that affected their own interests. By 15, the Shen Collective's shared body representative had issued a public statement calling for an emergency full council session to address the evidentiary disclosures. I know what happened in the Founding Five's private communications during those hours because one of the network's 41 members held a position in the Council's secure communications infrastructure that gave her access to metadata that, combined with the Atlas's existing financial mapping, was sufficient to reconstruct the general shape of what was being discussed even without the content of the communications themselves. I will not describe her position or her method, because she is still working. What I can say is that by 17th, the initial response had shifted from defensive to something more accurately described as triage. The Founding Five's legal teams had, by that point, assessed the Atlas documentation and arrived at the conclusion that Su Yian's team had spent 16 years ensuring they would arrive at, that the documentation was genuine, that it was legally admissible, that it was sufficiently comprehensive to be individually verifiable by any competent forensic analyst, and that contesting it would require either proving it incorrect, which it was not, or attacking the methodology that produced it, which would require disclosing information that the Founding Five's legal teams would very much prefer remained undisclosed. By 17, the triage had produced an internal consensus that I would summarize, based on what the network's intelligence allowed us to reconstruct, as the documentation cannot be successfully contested, the public disclosure cannot be recalled, and the question is therefore, what can be offered that limits the further damage? At 1845, Councillor Veyet's office transmitted a request for a private meeting at my earliest convenience. I scheduled it for 09 the following morning, because I had learned, over 11 years of diplomatic work, that accepting a meeting request immediately communicates something different from accepting it on a timeline that suggests you have other things to attend to first. The meeting room that Councillor Veyet's office offered was one I had been in many times. It was the room used for conversations the Council considered sensitive, small, comfortable by the standards of a facility designed primarily for species other than humans, lit in the soft blue tones that were presumably meant to encourage candor, and that I had spent 11 years finding slightly too deliberate to fully trust. Councillor Veyet was already seated when I arrived. She was alone, which was unusual. Presiding councillors customarily brought at least 2 aides to any meeting with a member representative. The absence of aides communicated something she had decided to communicate, which was that whatever she was going to say was being said as a personal statement rather than an institutional one. She looked, I thought, genuinely tired. Not tactically tired. Not the kind of tiredness that is performed to create sympathy. The specific tiredness of someone who has spent a long career maintaining a position of genuine impartiality in a structure that makes impartiality difficult, and who has just watched that structure do something that impartiality cannot accommodate. "Director Adeyemi," she said, "thank you for meeting with me." "Of course, Counselor." She was quiet for a moment in the way that I had come to recognize, over 11 years, as her way of choosing between versions of what she wanted to say. "Ambassador Chen Wei," she said, "I want you to know that I did not know what was happening in that facility. I want you to know that I have read the documentation transmitted yesterday, and that I believe it to be accurate, and that what it describes regarding the 3 detentions is something I would not have sanctioned if I had known it was occurring." I looked at her for a moment. "I believe you," I said, which was true, which made certain things more complicated and not less. The founding species' legal representatives have asked me to convey that they are prepared to engage in comprehensive discussions regarding the evidentiary submissions and their implications, she said. They wish to discuss this through the Council's formal dispute resolution process with a proposed framework for addressing the financial violations and the detentions separately and sequentially. "No," I said. She looked at me with an expression that was not surprise. She had been in council work for too long to be surprised by much. "The financial violations and the detentions are not separate matters," I said. The Atlas documentation demonstrates that they are connected by the same financial relationships. Addressing them separately would allow the formal dispute process to manage the pace and scope of accountability in ways that protect the interests of the parties most implicated. Earth is not prepared to allow that. What is Earth prepared to allow? She asked. I had spent the previous night in my office reading Chen Wei's 7 years of diplomatic records. He had written detailed notes on every meeting he attended, every conversation of professional significance, every instance where he believed something important had been communicated that was not in the official record. He had been, in his professional practice, exactly what the Council claimed to value: precise, thorough, honest, committed to the documentary record as the foundation of durable diplomatic relationship. His notes were now part of our formal submission to the Judicial Oversight Board. Earth is prepared to support a full independent tribunal, I said, with jurisdiction over both the financial violations and the detention events, convened under a framework that does not allow the founding species to appoint a majority of the tribunal's members. Earth is prepared to accept the Council's established financial penalty framework for confirmed violations, provided the penalties are applied without the discretionary reductions that the framework currently permits the presiding administrator to apply. Earth is prepared to consider the terms of a comprehensive detention reform package that removes the administrative discretion that allowed the routing decisions in all 3 cases to occur without appearing in any official record. And Earth requires, as a non-negotiable condition of any engagement with the dispute resolution process, the criminal referral of the administrator responsible for routing Ambassador Chen Wei's correction filing, and of the official in the Interspecies Relations Directorate whose communication preceded that routing decision. Councillor Veit was quiet for a long time. That last condition, she said carefully, names a currently serving senior official. Yes, I said. The founding species legal teams will resist it. I expect they will, I said. I would like to know whether you will resist it. She looked at me for a long time with an expression I had not seen on her face in 11 years of interactions. It was not the neutral impartiality she wore as a professional posture. It was something older and more personal. No, she said quietly. I will not resist it. The negotiations that followed lasted 6 weeks and produced a framework that was not everything Earth had demanded and was significantly more than the founding 5 had initially offered, which is what most consequential diplomatic outcomes look like. When one side has leverage, it has not fully deployed, and the other side knows it. The criminal referral was filed. The independent tribunal was convened. The financial penalty framework was applied without discretionary reduction to 31 of the 83 documented violations, the 12 that the tribunal's initial assessment rated as most clearly intentional and most directly harmful. The detention reform package was adopted as provisional regulation pending full council ratification, which was completed 8 months later, with the specific margin that suggested several founding species had calculated that opposing it publicly was more costly than accepting it. The atlas remained in Earth's possession. It was not submitted in its entirety to any public record. This was deliberate. The 31 violations pursued in the initial tribunal were selected not because they were the most severe, but because they were the most cleanly documented and the most legally straightforward. The atlas contained documentation of 52 additional violations. The founding 5's legal teams knew this. They knew because we had told them. In a private communication sent through Councillor Veit's office the morning before the negotiations began, that the initial submissions represented a portion of the available documentation and that Earth's position regarding further disclosure would depend, in part, on the good faith demonstrated in the resolution of the initial submissions. This was not a threat. It was a description of facts. The same distinction I had made many times in many rooms. Su Yan Park retired from the Atlas program 3 years after the tribunal concluded. She moved to a small house in Jeju, where she grows things I could not name in Korean, and which she photographs extensively and sends to former colleagues with captions that suggest she finds the process of growing things considerably more straightforward than the process of tracing financial instruments across 7 layers of nominee entities, which is probably true. She came to the memorial service for Chen Wei, held in Geneva 2 months after the negotiations concluded. She stood at the edge of the gathering, which was her habitual position at any gathering, and when I found her afterward, she was looking at the inscription on the memorial stone that Chen Wei's family had chosen. The inscription was a line from his notes, from a meeting he had attended in his second year as deputy ambassador, in which a Vithrani delegate had described human diplomatic engagement as touching in its persistence. Chen Wei had written in his notes, "I have decided to take this as a compliment." His family had chosen it because it was exactly the kind of thing he would have said, and because they believed, correctly, that he would have wanted to be remembered as someone who found something to appreciate even in the things that were meant to diminish him. Su Yan read it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, to no one in particular, "He was right to take it as a compliment. Persistence is the only thing that actually works." I thought about 16 years of financial documentation, about 41 people building careers in council institutions, year by year, developing expertise and relationships, and the specific unglamorous knowledge of how things actually function that is more useful than any classified intelligence. About the fact that none of it had prevented Chen Wei from dying in a facility on Theta Prime Station, and also about the fact that what it had enabled, in the months after his death, was the most consequential accountability proceeding in 60 years of council history. There is a question I have been asked many times since. Was it worth it? The 16 years. The 41 people living partial lives. The specific weight of carrying something that could not be discussed with anyone outside the program. I have a complicated relationship with that question. I think the honest answer is that worth it is not quite the right frame. What the program produced was not a transaction. It did not redeem what happened to Chen Wei, and it was not intended to. What it produced was change. Specific, documented, durable change in the systems that had made what happened to him possible. The detention reform package is now permanent regulation. The independent tribunal's precedents have been cited in 4 subsequent proceedings involving junior member species. The Atlas's continuing existence has, as best as we can determine from the patterns in the Founding Five's policy behavior over the subsequent years, produced a measurable change in the calculation of what can be done quietly. None of that brings Chen Wei back. I am aware of that. I was aware of it the morning I transmitted the activation signal, and I transmitted it anyway, because I believed then, and believe now, that the correct response to a system that made his death possible was not to grieve it only, but to dismantle the mechanism, carefully and completely, and with the specific patience of people who understand that the most durable changes are built over years, rather than announced in moments. My daughter is 14 years old. She is growing up in a world where the events I have described are part of the historical record, available to be studied, debated, and argued about in exactly the way that important things should be. She asked me last spring, in the specific, direct way she has of asking things she has been thinking about for some time, "Did you know it was going to work?" I thought about Su Yan saying that persistence is the only thing that actually works, and about the 16 years it takes to build something that works, and about the specific relationship between knowing something will work and choosing to build it anyway on the basis of believing it should. I knew we had done the work, I said. Whether the work would be enough, no, I didn't know that. She thought about this. But you did it anyway. Yes, because it was right. I thought about Chen Wei and his wheat field and his uncomplicated happiness and his 7 years of careful, precise, honest diplomatic notes that were now part of the permanent record of a proceeding that had changed the council in ways he had spent his entire career trying to change through conversation. Because it was right, I said, and because he would have wanted us to try. She seemed satisfied with this, in the way that 14-year-olds are satisfied with answers that confirm the adults they trust have thought carefully about the things that matter. She went back to her homework. I sat for a while, in the quiet of the evening, and outside the window the lights of Geneva were coming on one by one in the early dark, and somewhere in a council chamber on Theta Prime Station, proceedings were underway that used precedents established in the months after Chen Wei died. And the system that had made his death useful to the people who arranged it was a different system now, and the difference was documented and permanent and built by people who had understood, for 16 years, that the point of building something in the dark was not that the dark was where you wanted to stay. It was that the dark was where you had to start.